Today we're going to discuss your technique and working process. And I thought we could start with the process that I think is probably the most obscure of the two processes that you use, the behind plexiglas technique or reverse painting technique. And we can see it in several of the works that are in the show, which the earliest work starts in 1966, which is Wiggly Woman, which is painted in that technique, but there's also a really amazing large painting called Misty Garment, which would be nice maybe to speak about how this thing happens, from the materials you use to how you actually go about painting a reverse plexi painting.
The reverse part of it is a normal painting, you're painting on a surface and you're looking at the paint itself. And what I'm doing is I'm working on a piece of 1/8" plexiglass, and the paint's on the other side of the plexiglass. So you're looking at through the 1/8" of plexiglass at the paint, which has been applied to the back or the reverse side of the plexi. I got into using that, partly from my interest as a kid, playing pinball machines, and I just like the feel of those images on the vertical part that are, against the glass where all the numbers are changing, etc. It was just simply that interest that led me to do it.
So it was the visual quality of the sort of hardness and sharpness.
The feel of it.
Yeah, the feel of it.
Every painting, an Impressionist painting is very different than an early Renaissance painting, etc. I mean, each painting has its characteristics, its feel, its touch, whatever, and this has a singularly different feel to it. I would work out my ideas, shapes and forms, on a drawing, the same size as the plexiglass.
And this would be called a cartoon.
It's literally, the historical term, cartoon. Once I was satisfied with the drawing, I would tape it to the plexiglass. So now I'm looking through the plexiglass at my drawing. And then I would start painting, and I would need to paint what usually, when you're painting on a surface, would be the last thing. I would start with the lines, and I would paint all of the lines. And then once the lines that encompass each shape or form, I would then start painting the larger areas of colors. In the case of Misty Garment, there's a line, very tiny line that is, that surrounds. It's about an eighth of an inch wide. Each one of the forms is, encased by this line. And then in the case of the face, I would once all of the line work had been completed, I would paint in the white of the face. Although first I would probably, there are a lot of smaller forms. For instance, the eye form has an orangey shape sort of emanating from it. All of that would have been painted first, the lines first, then the colors that make up that shape. Because acrylics generally are not that opaque when applied, I would need to paint a color many times. If I just painted one layer of the orange and then painted something on top of it, what was on top of it in the back, would show through. It would expose where some areas were more or less heavier or not as well, the coverage. In any case, you have to paint it like three or four times. I can't remember, but it's a number of times.
And so you used acrylic paints.
Yeah, as it turns out, acrylic bonds extremely well with plexiglass. When you put it on, because it's a little bit watered down to get the right consistency with the brush to make a line, you can sort of scratch it if you've gone somewhere where you don't like it, and it'll lift off. You let it sit there for about 15 or 20 minutes, it's a little harder to scrape off. About an hour later, it really doesn't want to, and the next day you can't get it off.
It's a permanent chemical bond.
Yeah, there were some paintings that I really didn't like, and because of the cost of the plexi, I started soaking them, and I soaked them in a bathtub for a week, and that stuff would not come off. So.
Wow. So let me just get this straight. So once you tape the cartoon, it's taped technically on the front of the plexi, and then you lay it down and you're working from the back, but at some point you don't see the cartoon anymore because you've covered up pretty much the whole surface with your imagery. So you're almost kind of painting blind in a way.
Well, no. In a sense, you aren't, because you're doing the lines first, and they really encompass the areas. Periodically, I would take the cartoon slightly off. It would sort of depend how many of the lines I'd already had, so that everything was where they were supposed to be. But I would sort of try to keep track of how things are going.
So what kind of paintbrushes were you using for, I mean, obviously the lines, you used a smaller brush.
What I used was a sign painter's brush, very narrow one, and it holds its shape very, very nicely. It's got a long bristle, so it'll hold a certain amount of liquid. Because I would thin the paint so that it would flow off the brush, it holds not a point, but it holds a shape. And so you can get them in different sizes. So if you're doing an 1/8" line, you get one that when it's wet, makes an 1/8" line. I sort of refer to it as a dumb line. In other words, it doesn't change in shape.
Well, it seems like that makes a lot of sense, because many signs are actually painted on the reverse, or in the old days they were on the reverse of glass. So that tool seems like it was really custom made for what you wanted to get to. The color of these earlier paintings is very bright and vibrant. And was that in part because of the materials that you were using that it allowed that, or was that just your palette back then?
It was a combination of two things. I like that palette, and it worked with the plexiglass because they end up having a very bright and fairly intense feel.
One of the things that you mentioned as being, kind of a very positive thing of this paint bonding and making this kind of seamless surface that really lasts, it doesn't crack or chip off, is also kind of a difficulty, because, like you said, you soaked the painting for a week in the bathtub and the paint wasn't coming off. That means you couldn't make a change.
Yeah.
If you weren't happy with something, you had to kind of live with it or throw it out and start again.
Because I didn't do a very carefully laid out color scheme. I knew what I wanted, and one thing led to another. But I became frustrated that I couldn't make tiny adjustments. I couldn't make the line just a tad darker or a tad lighter, and eventually the only way I could get at that was to work on the surface. And so I finally stopped, after about 3 years, 4 years, I was working almost exclusively with the plexiglass, and then I moved to working with canvas or panels. When I stopped working on behind the surface on plexi, I began doing my drawings for the paintings on the surface. Drawing on a gessoed surface is not the easiest thing in the world, particularly when you don't like what you've done.
Because of the nub of the canvas, or?
And some of it has to do with that, although usually I eliminate the aggressive nub that you would find on most canvases.
You sand it down?
No, a combination of a little bit of sanding, and also by using multiple layers of acrylic gesso, thinned with water and medium to keep it flexible. In any case, when I finally when I work out a drawing that I like, then I mechanically transfer this to the prepared linen canvas, and I make a tracing of it. Turn the tracing paper over, run a 2B pencil around all of the lines. Then I put the paper on the canvas, trace it onto the canvas, take the tracing paper off. It looks horrible.
The image on the canvas looks horrible too.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't look right. And just when you're trying to trace a tiny little form, you quite often get the curve slightly wrong or something. And so then I look at it, and then I redraw it and make it look right. Get rid of the excess grease by sort of washing it, graphite, and then I put a layer of thin medium over it to keep the graphite from dirtying any colors.
Right, from leaching through to the color. Yeah.
And then I just start painting.
Because again, you still use the acrylic medium. I think many people might glance at these paintings and think they're oil paintings, but it's still the acrylic medium that you use.
Yeah. Anyone that they're not imitations of oils. I mean, it's just the way it's worked out. And anybody that's worked with acrylics knows it's about the dumbest way of painting that there is. It's not the smartest move, but it's something that I sort of segued into when I left plexi and then moved to the surface. For the most part, the paintings were pretty much the same. They were large areas of flat color that weren't modeled. So I continued to use the acrylic, which lends itself to the painting that way. And as I became more interested in developing volumes or weighty forms, I found ways of doing it. And because our paintings are relatively small, it's not that big a problem.
Well, for a lay audience who may not understand what you mean when it's like one of the dumbest ways of making a painting, is it because it dries so quickly?
Well, yeah, the difference between an oil, using oils and acrylic is that the acrylics do dry very rapidly, within a minute, if it's a thin layer. And mine, because I thin the paint enough so that there's a visual mark, but there's not a physical mark.
So there's no brush stroke, physical brush stroke.
There really
isn't.
There obviously is, when you start getting to a microscope, but in practical terms, it doesn't leave a physical brush stroke. Certainly not the way you would find in, say, a Van Gogh. Even in the areas of Van Goghs that are fairly thinly painted, there's a physicality to the individual stroke that isn't part of the way I paint.
Jennifer Gross, in one of the essays in the Kellogg, talks about a technique that either she just interpreted that that's what you use, or in fact it's just the same thing that conservators often use, of this kind of painting in technique where you build up layers of small cross-hatching with maybe slightly different tones of color. Is that how you go about creating the modeling and the shimmering surfaces?
I hadn't made the connection that she did, but the acrylic's not very opaque to begin with, and then I thin it down, it's even less so. So I need to, if I wanted to paint a flat area of a middle tone, I probably have to paint it 5 or 6 times before it would be opaque over a white surface. And then in terms of making an adjustment, say, in a form, moving from a light to dark, instead of blending, which you would do because with oils where the paint is, stays moist for an extended period of time, like a day or two, depending, where you could blend a light and a dark together, and you could have if you wanted an even transition, you could have it. In a sense, what I have to do is paint different values of a color that dry pretty much the same at the beginning and the end of the brush stroke, and then you change to another value, and you keep doing this. But then there's a kind of translucency that sort of develops, and so in a sense, quite often it ends up being very much what she was describing, because I do a lot of hatching lines and stuff and layers that move on top of one another.
In some of the pieces that you'll see in the show, there are some wooden frames on the paintings, but most of the frames are painted by you on masonite or medium density fiberboard. And how did that start happening, where you really wanted the frame to be an integral part of the piece to the point you're painting?
That goes back to when I was a student. I mean, I really did have the feeling, partly because I think of seeing, certainly someone like Paul Klee, who quite often would have very simple frames. Sometimes they're more elaborate. The way he would take a drawing and he would mount it onto a board, and then he controlled the environment that the piece was in. And I was very interested. I became interested in it at that point. So from the very beginning, whether it's a very tiny frame, as in the case banding Misty Garment, I wanted that dark green line. It's a visual. Physically, I needed to have a support for the plexiglas, but I also wanted to control that, and I really didn't want to leave it up to somebody else's choices. So it's a combination of wanting to control its environment, the way the image moves toward the wall, so that somebody else doesn't do that for me. And in the case of the later paintings, I began to conceive the paintings with this field, because the frames are fairly wide. It's about a 4.5 to 5 inch band of solid color. Once I have a fairly good idea of where the painting is going, I start painting the frame so that I can, I'll work on it, and then I'll put the picture, just sit it in the frame.
Because you're working on the frame as a separate thing, sitting next to it on the table, or so to speak.
Periodically.
It's not on the painting at that point?
No. It's free of the painting, but I just sit it in there and I take a look at it, and it's a way for me to read the way the colors are working in the picture. In other words, the background around the head, yeah, I know it's going to be encapsulated, surrounded by another color, and how it works, how the space works. It's necessary for me to start keeping an eye on that, and so. The frames unfortunately change as many colors as the paintings do, because when once you change one thing, you've got to change something else invariably.
So if you're at the point where you have the background color behind the head and you've painted a frame, and then you decide that background color just isn't working and you have to change it, then you have to repaint the frame. That's what you're saying?
Yeah.
Sometimes.
Well, you're one or the other. Sometimes the frame really looks good, and then you have to change the background.
Change the background color.
I mean, it really is that simple. I mean, what's working more? What's the most interesting part is really how you make your choices, what you change.
Can we talk a little bit about the kind of progression of color choices in your palette and how your sense of color has changed over the years to what it is today?
Well, the changes have sort of come about in what I would assume to be fairly natural, as opposed to a conceptual. I think I need to, for these reasons, change my colors. At the end of the plexiglas period around 1970, and then working on the surface, as I was able to manipulate, make these changes on the canvas, I started doing these things to the color. I began finding more ways of things to. The color, it worked differently in my head, and to the point that by about 1975, I was working almost entirely in various grays.
And we have a couple examples of those paintings in the show. One is a sort of self-portrait called Wee Jim's Black Eye.
Actually, that painting literally comes a little bit later. What I was thinking was something that, where I'm it's sort of like starting here with this kind of color, and then I'm narrowing my focus. And at a certain point, I said, that's it, that's enough. And so I really wanted to get back to richer colors, and I think Hello and Shush, those are examples of that. And then after being, working with really intense colors again, I said, I just want to do black and white, because I do like the combination of black and white. And the problem I have is that my first painting is black and white, and then the next one's black, white, and a little bit of gray, and then there's more gray, and then I said, well, how does black, white, and yellow work? Earth tones at the time in the early, late 60s, for me, they just did not work with the acrylics. There's something about there must have been some chemical kind of thing going on, and they would separate. They were very difficult to work with. So if I were really focused on that, I wouldn't have been using acrylics in the earlier work, because they just didn't work well. And but in any case, I began using a little bit, and whether it was a change of brand or manufacturers had figured it out. In any case, I started working with finding that some raw umber and burnt umber were really very usable, and so then I began going and working with colors that I just had never ever had a chance to really work with. So the work probably starting at the very late 80s through the early 90s. Daft is one that's got a lot of very muted tones. There's some very rich color in there, but I'm playing around with a lot of umbers, gray, beige, whatever. After playing with that for a few years, I just moved out of that, and am now, for whatever reason, I'm really interested in working in blues, lavenders, greens, and so on.
Do you feel that you're influenced more, as far as color, by the natural world, because you were talking about earth tones just now, or is it from looking at other painting?
I think it would probably have more to do with other colors. In other words, I sometimes marvel at, visual phenomena, out there, but I don't think to myself,
like what color would I paint that in? Yeah.
With the exception, there was a few, about 10 years ago, we have a rather large funkia plants or something, and there was the blossom. It was one of the really big funkia, and the blossom was really, or the bulb as it came out was fascinating, whatever. One day suddenly, I said, "Oh, that's really nice," and I cut it
color.
quickly and ran upstairs, and of course it faded immediately. But yeah, so I don't. I think when I'm out on the street, or walking in nature, I'm just sort of like, "Oh my goodness," kind of thing, rather than thinking.
So when you're actually painting and involved in painting, you're just looking at the color.
Yeah, I really am.
Visualizing the color.
And then all the different things that you can do with a color. I mean, there's so different many ways of making a red that's almost identical to this red, but it's not quite. I mean, they really come from you're using very different, literal different paints to hues to get to it. I don't know quite how to describe it, because now I don't think about it. I just I sort of fumble my way. I'm used to it's kind of like walking through a forest, I guess, where you get to the other end, but you're not quite sure how you got there.